In this unit, we're reconsidering plot as an element in the fictional writer's toolbox and how plot works. Later, we'll look at how plot works in the novel, but we're going to focus on the short story to begin with here. First, to define plot from the outside, some writers will say that there's basically only two simple plots, that every story kind of mirrors one of these two plots. One is that a man or woman went on a journey, and the other possible plot is a stranger came to town. So plot in itself can be very simply defined and very simply understood against life, which is complex and complicated sometimes. And so you can look at the stories that we've looked at in the course so far and kind of think about, how does plot kind of try to simplify life itself. The goal with plot for a fiction writer is to move beyond a simple episode or anecdote, or, a simple moment, but to try to get at the larger meanings present within the life or within human consciousness and human interactions with the world. And so plot has traditionally been defined by conflict, how the human being defines him or herself within the world. And so you may have discussed this in English classes before, that the conflict can reflect human versus human interaction. It can involve a human being against the self, the human being against nature, the human being against society, the human being against the divine or God, or human being against technology or a machine. So conflict is traditionally driven. If you read, if you go back to the stories we've looked at in the course so far, you can note those moments of conflict and how those define the central tensions of the story. Plot is also about cause and effect, as defined as the sequence of events in a prose narrative. The sequencing is the key thing for a writer often, to try to understand plot through how things are sequenced. The great English writer E.M. Forster gave this example, that a story might be the king died, the queen died, but plot becomes a matter of cause and effect. So the plot for Forster's simple story there is that the king died, then out of grief the queen died. So as you kind of think about the plotting of a story, what are the links of cause and effect that happen? How does one event lead to the next as the story develops? Look for cause and effect within the plot. That plotting can be kind of dense at times. The great short story teacher Janet Burway notes that the short story as a form is often marked by density, the kind of deep conflicts that engage the characters, and as they kind of unfold, there's something that might be at stake between the characters or within the characters there. Those conflicts lead to a crisis or building complication, and then typically find a moment of resolution near the end of the story. You can ask that of maybe the stories that we've looked at in the course so far. Is there a point of resolution there ultimately in the story, or do things remain unresolved perhaps by the story's end? A classic example in the 20th century has been James Joyce, the Irish writer, whose stories in the collection Dubliners had moments of what are called epiphanies, moments where a character had sudden realization that his or her memory comes together with the moment that the character's in, and there's a sudden realization about life, where a character has a moment of recognition or discovery about him or herself and the society that surrounds the character. These epiphanies have kind of defined a lot of short stories as the 20th century's kind of unfolded. But I really like the comment made by the writer Elif Batuman, who says that the short story's form often is about absence or missed opportunities and brief encounters that occur in the margins of the story. That even with a short story, there are other things happening around the character. There are events, there's relationships, there are histories that are unfolding around the character. So how does the short story work as a slice within that larger world that's present? When you try to diagram the plot of a story, it's typically linear or a straight line in structure. That Again, events are linked by cause and effect. There's a central conflict or tension within the story that builds to a moment of climax. And so you may have come across the basic plot for the short story in what's called the von Freytag pyramid, where a story has a moment of introduction or setting where the characters are introduced and the main conflict begins to develop through a course of rising action. It reaches a point of climax where the conflict is highlighted, and then is immediately confronted, and then slowly the story works its way out through a course of falling action to a point of resolution, or denouement in the end, where everything returns to the order of the beginning of the story. Now the question is, does life really kind of work like that? Are there moments of resolution, or are there moments where you have these kind of epiphany moments where you have sudden realizations or not? And you can kind of go back through the course's stories and kind of rethink whether there are those kinds of moments that are present within them. Edgar Allan Poe, the great American short story writer in the 19th century, said that the story should aim for a singular effect, right? That the story should produce a certain defined feeling within the reader. And for Poe, that was always typically horror, although the stories can aim for other kinds of feelings as well. And maybe you can think about the course stories here and think about, did those stories leave you with a particular emotional reading in the end, whether that was a sense of discomfort or shame or anger, frustration, or even horror itself. That effect is one thing that the writer might aim for as the story develops. As the 20th century unfolded, a lot of writers were trying to complicate that sense of that linear plot, that sense that the short story can be so clearly diagrammed within a point-to-point fashion within a line of building action and climax and falling action and resolution. And so writers tried other kinds of form and other kinds of ways of thinking about plot. The English writer Virginia Woolf, earlier in the 20th century, thought a lot about like concentric models or circular models for plot, right? Where at the center of the story there's something happening, or there's a character and things are happening around the character. So you kind of have these circular movements of the character's psychological insights or awareness, and as the world kind of spins around the character has a growing awareness of what defines him or her in the world, what defines kind of human capacity or human presence within that world. One of the things that can define that is obsession. That characters can become obsessed with certain things, or characters can become obsessed with the past in some way, and the plot itself is a character trying to make amends for the past, perhaps in some way, or trying to recover some sense of who they were in the past. And you can think about the stories that we've read so far in the course and how obsession might play into the way that the plot works. Other writers, like the Russian short story writer, late 19th century Anton Chekhov, thought about how stories invoke moods, that they may not have a plot to them at all, but the characters might interact in a way that sets a kind of mood for the reader as the story unfolds. One thing I always like to have writers in creative classes think about are the beginnings and endings of plot. What parts of the story are plotted and told? Are there outside stories that surround the plot? So a nice example here is always, if you're going to give the plot of your own life, if you're going to write an autobiography, where do you begin and end it right now? Do you start with your birth? Do you start with your parents' lives? Do you start with your grandparents' lives? Do you start with something that happened to you 10 minutes ago and work your way back and forth in time? So you can see that the plot can become quite complex in a way. It may not just simply be a straight line thing, and that you might be telling one line of the story, but there are other lines of the story that exist and begin and end in other places. So you can think about the surrounding stories or the surrounding narratives that are also a part of the plot. Writers will use the term metafiction to describe a kind of fiction where the narrator may be aware that the narration is simply a story, and that it's kind of a playful way. The writer Italo Calvino writes quite often with metafiction, and to very kind of comic effect. In the end, you can also think about the question of realism and plot. Do you, as you walk through the world, are you narrating a plot in your head? Is that a realistic way of moving through the world? So writers in the 20th century also kind of experimented with stream of consciousness as a means of narration. Just everything that comes into your head, is it part of the plot? So like simple kind of moments of discomfort. Does the character have to narrate those as a way of telling the story? These are all kinds of complications that you might find with the traditional plot of the short story. As we look at these stories, you can kind of rethink, whether or not those stories fall into, kind of simple linear pattern, or whether perhaps they choose a more kind of complex or experimental form as they tell the stories. So that's kind of some introductions to the ways that short stories are plotted, and we'll continue later with the novel and look at plotting in the novel.